Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
In the process of getting acquainted in an academic setting with the study of Tanakh, of Hebrew Bible, and of rabbinic text, one thing that quickly became clear to me was that there were a few stories that had foundational and lasting effects on the shape of Jewish identity. And that as far back as those stories exist in time, in terms of their origins, their impact is so embedded in our liturgy, in our text, and in our minds that we keep coming back to them over and over again. I was interested in how the text form identity and shape people's lives over the span of a lifetime and over generations. And of course, the story that has the most drama, perverse, as far as I'm concerned, packed into it is the story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. And particularly interesting to me as I studied the story, studied its composition and redaction, at least the theories around that through text criticism. I was also interested in how the story shaped Jewish memory. And when I say memory, I mean Jewish memory. I mean the way the culture itself remembers its own history, its own archetypal stories, and the tension between those two. Judaism explicitly recognizes the tension between text and history. Text is the interpretation of what happens based on the covenantal relationship between the Jewish people and its God. And as Judaism moves into modernity, even if God, the idea and the conception of God changes or falls away altogether, the existential foundational questions raised by the narratives take on even more urgency in a way. And I became interested in looking at the binding of Isaac story through the series of crises that beset Jewish culture throughout its history. The binding of Isaac story becomes one of the principal ways that Judaism finds evidence of divine care even in the midst of crisis. Starting out, of course, with Abraham, the idea is that even in the midst of this most horrible test, from which there seems to be no good way out, either he disobeys God's request or he murders his son, moving through the crises of Jewish history, including the destruction of the temple, the dispersal of the people, the numerous persecutions and massive slaughters, the story of the Akedah keeps being returned to because it asks and provides a potential answer to the question, what do we do when the tension between our current circumstances and our foundational stories is so great that something has to give? And there's different answers throughout history. There are different answers from different segments of Israelite and later Jewish society. But those answers all show deep respect for the story itself and deep compassion for the characters who are both actually in the story and the characters like Sarah who are excluded from the story and like Ishmael in Jewish tradition. So I was fascinated with the Akedah because I see it showing in 22 verses and the massive commentary that comes on those verses, how we seek to interpret past stories in terms of present crisis, and how we find evidence of divine care by interpreting them in light of those stories from our foundational past. What I'd like to start with is how rabbinic interpreters interpret Abraham's actions, because he says so little that they find in his actions or lack thereof the unique ability that Abraham has, they claim, to simultaneously obey and disobey God. That is, to interpret his words in a way that gives him the maximum latitude for the most amount of time he can manage until he can no longer delay. Then he must act. And there are several moments of interpretation along the way. One of the remarkable aspects of the story of how Abraham responds to God's request, and it is a request, not a command, is to delay, according to the rabbis, the procedure and make the whole process of pilgrimage and preparation for sacrifice take as long as possible. So Abraham gets the request from God, rises early the next morning, which causes Maimonides to say he received this request in a prophetic dream, that it came to him in his sleep, which is a very elevated form of prophecy, according to Maimonides. But then he proceeds to take a series of steps that slow the whole process down. He gathers all his servants, then he saddles his own donkey, he cuts the wood for the sacrifice when he has servants to do so, and then he takes 3 days to make a journey that the rabbis calculate based on where he is in the Torah text. It takes him 3 days to make a journey of 8 hours. So it would appear that Abraham is, on one level, playing for time, hoping that matters will become more clear. And this is his first series of interpretive actions, and almost actions that are, I wouldn't say bargaining with God, but trying to force more clarity out of the situation. The dialogue with Isaac is very spare on the way up the mountain, and everything happens in doubles. And this is important because repetition and mimetic transformation are incredibly important in biblical texts. I'll explain by what I mean by mimetic. So mimesis is an idea that is most broadly developed in Greek philosophy, in theory around the performing and visual arts, having to do with interpretation and representation and copying. But Michael Taussig has a very brief, very helpful definition of mimesis, which I think is very important to the idea of ritual sacrifice. And of course, ritual sacrifice is at the basis of the story of the binding of Isaac. If we can understand how this story shapes the whole institution of ritual sacrifice, then we understand a lot about how it continues to shape Jewish tradition, practice, and thought after the destruction of the temple. Here's what Michael Taussig, here's how he describes mimesis. Mimesis is the faculty to copy, imitate, make models, explore difference, yield into, and become other. The wonder of mimesis lies in the copy drawing on the character and power of the original, to the point whereby the representation may even assume that character and that power. This means that copies aren't mere imitations or line drawings or tracings. Remember the tracings of tombstones and engravings that we did as kids in school? It's not that. It is the taking on of the power of something else by the doing and repeating of a procedure that involves that other thing. Sacrifice is mimetic in its essence because you are repeating a process that Abraham really began with the near sacrifice of Isaac. The institution is all based on repetitions and refinements and reformulations of what Abraham originally did. But those sacrifices take on the actual character and the importance of Isaac. So the slaughtered ram is, in a very real sense, Isaac himself takes on not just Isaac's place on the altar, but in some very real sense, it takes on the essence of Isaac. So the substitution becomes the thing itself. This is a very complicated idea, but the rabbis say in some of the ancient strata of rabbinic text that Isaac is slaughtered and that he's revived by the celestial retinue, that the tears of angels wash him off the altar and into the Garden of Eden, where he is resurrected by celestial dew, whisked back onto the altar, where Abraham tries to slaughter him a second time. So even in the act of sacrifice itself, the rabbis think Abraham so desperately wants to fulfill what God has asked of him that when God prevents it and the angels prevent it, he tries a second time. But the second time, he sees the ram in the thicket. It's really important to remember that God doesn't say, "Thou shalt take the ram in the thicket." He sees it, interprets it as a worthy substitution, slaughters the ram, tachat bano, in place of his son. And it is that point that there is a second angelic intervention in which it is said to Abraham, because thou hast done this thing, and maybe this thing is the interpretation of substituting the ram for Isaac. So the mimetic substitution, the act of putting the ram in Isaac's place, gives the story its miraculous power, the way human beings can transform their circumstances through interpretation. That is what we have, as Jews, have been doing ever since we had the Torah. We have been reading it to change our circumstances. We have been reinterpreting it in light of new circumstances. And we have been finding ways to understand how in the cracks and crevices of catastrophe, God is waiting for us to discover how God is showing evidence of divine care. Because through reinterpretation, we're granted sacred avenues toward escape and renewal and rejuvenation and recommitment to covenant. The substitution of the ram for the favored son is often interpreted as God providing a rationale for the definitive end of human sacrifice. But when you read on in Tanakh, including in Kings and in the prophets, you come across stories where child sacrifice is still practiced, and where the prophets have to inveigh against it, and where the prophets get messages from God who says, I made them engage in practices that were not good so that I could then punish them for those practices. This is in the book of Ezekiel. There are very similar stories in the book of Jeremiah where God says, child sacrifice never even came to my mind, and yet you were doing it. In Ezekiel, we have, I misled them on purpose. In Jeremiah, we essentially have, what could you have been thinking? And Ezekiel and Jeremiah's prophetic careers overlap right about the time of the exile to Babylonia. So here we have a seam in the fabric of Jewish cultural memory around the question of, were we actually, as a culture, sacrificing children? The short answer is yes. Cultures around us did it, and there were instances in which it's clear that it was expected of us as well, us meaning Israelites. But the interpretation, the interpretive possibility was always there, that Abraham takes the most extreme possible interpretation, and that interpretation is never to be taken, or that if it is taken, it's a caution, and it's a caution that makes God back away a little bit. After the Akedah, God and Abraham do not interact any further. Abraham remarries and has several more children, and goes on and lives almost an entire second adult life away from this enormous covenantal pressure that we read about in the book of Genesis. One of the messages here is that child sacrifice is something that is all around the Israelite environment. Many of the surrounding cultures practice it. And it is clear that early on, Israel practices child sacrifice as well. And there is evidence even in the book of Exodus that God says, you shall consecrate the firstborn to me of your field and your family. I'm paraphrasing. And essentially, this is a very hard question to ask. Is the consecration of the firstborn symbolic, or is it actual? Clarification comes later. But in the book of Exodus, God demands the firstborn. There is some archaeological evidence to suggest that firstborns were sacrificed according to interpretations of Sinaitic law. So the end of child sacrifice through the binding of Isaac is a very complicated question. A lot of people shy away from the story of binding of Isaac because it seems so terrible. Through the example of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, the question is, can there be a suspension of the ethical because God has demanded it? Can God's command be greater than ethics? And then what happens to ethics? But the fact is, in many respects, I think, without the story of the binding of Isaac, we don't have the ethical leaps that become possible later. As horrible as the story is, in fact, in some ways, its very horribleness enables us to step back from sacrificial procedure, which in general seems kind of, bloodthirsty and gross to us today, and say, if it weren't for the need to interpret a command that's multifaceted and vague, we would not have arrived at many of the ethical foundational precepts that Judaism provides us today. And it's because of the binding of Isaac story, of the difficult question of whether it in fact is the definitive end of child sacrifice, or whether it seeds that idea that can fully blossom later, that we have one of the many facets of this complicated and devastating story. I think in more recent interpretations, the rabbinic interpretations in general, not entirely, are focused on Abraham, what he could possibly be going through, what he could be thinking, how he's going to manage this conflict. In later interpretations, the question of how does Isaac, where does Isaac fit into this story? Why are we so consumed with Abraham and not with the person to whom this is done? Great Italian paintings and great Renaissance paintings focus some on Isaac, but more on Abraham. Aaron Kohler, in his book Unbinding Isaac, spends some time on the Caravaggio painting of Isaac, of Abraham and Isaac, which shows Isaac looking terrified in the direction of the viewer of the painting. We actually see the effect of the Akedah on him. So in the same way, I'm saying all this because in the same way that the binding of Isaac story doesn't represent the definitive end of child sacrifice, but enables us to begin thinking about it, in just the same way, the interpretation of the story enables us to begin thinking not only about ourselves as part of Klal Yisrael, but as individuals. I think the binding of Isaac story, when seen through the perspective of Isaac, enables Israel, Israelite, and later Jewish thought to focus not only on communal survival and well-being, but on the hegemony of the individual in a way that really spurs the Enlightenment. Of course, this is not only true in Israelite and Jewish religious practice, but it's true in Christianity and Islam as well. Christianity, as you know, sees the binding of Isaac story as a prefiguration of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And it is through the focus on the terror and trauma of the individual that the story draws out the ethical ideas that the individual has sanctity and should have agency, and that there should not be needless slaughter to try to propitiate a divine being or series of beings. Now, this kind of interpretation becomes important later in the formation of the State of Israel and the defense of the State of Israel, where parents sending their children off to war see themselves as Abraham putting his child on the altar, and causes the younger generations after the wars of the formation of the State of Israel, especially in the Yom Kippur War, as seeing themselves as Isaac, submitted to imperious and almost arbitrary decree by a generation that's blindly following its own God. And this causes a kind of cultural backlash in Israel, represented especially by David Grossman and A.B. Yehoshua, who think the binding of Isaac story should just go away. A.B. Yehoshua calls it a black bird hovering over our history, that the story so oppresses, so weighs down on the culture by the idea that sacrifice must be endured for the sake of sanctification, that there has to be a radical reapproach to the story, or it just has to be excised entirely from our tradition because there's no good way to interpret it. From my point of view, the story is fundamental to the shaping of Jewish memory, because the story requires us to interpret in light of our current circumstances. You can't get away from the story, but you can't get away with only giving it one interpretation either. This is why, for example, in the Crusades, the story is seen as precedent for the mass martyrdom of communities that are faced with either conversion or annihilation, and are said to have practiced mass suicide rather than be forced to convert to Christianity. And why, on the other hand, Shalom Spiegel, in his masterwork, The Last Trial, without ever mentioning the Holocaust, talks about the midrashic interpretations of the binding of Isaac as showing that we must confront the repeated annihilations of communities and oppression of Jewish communities as something that is repeatedly interpreted through the story of the binding of Isaac. Shalom Spiegel in The Last Trial interprets a poem by Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn that talks about mass martyrdom of the communities. And without ever saying that he's talking about the Holocaust, he's writing in 1950. It's clear that he is doing a cyclical millennial return to the subject of how, in the midst of slaughter, we have to try to find evidence of meaning and even potentially of divine care. In his devastating book, the Binding of Isaac story never goes away. Isaac is both alive and dead, both slaughtered and resurrected. And in the same way, he stands for the Jewish community that is swept off the altar of history by a saving grace, but lives in the shadow of trauma ever after. So this is one of the many riches of the story that enables us to see it as a lens through which we remember, whether we know it or not. We're remembering through a 20-verse story that says stuff will happen to you whose meaning you cannot fathom, but it has meaning, whose evidence of divine care you cannot find, but it's there if you look for it, whose story is brutal and terrifying and speaks of the awesome, arbitrary, capricious power of God, but also shows evidence of covenantal commitment. In other words, the story is a series of paradoxes through which we can constantly try to make sense of that which doesn't make sense, which is the passage of time and the existence of Jewish culture, history, and worship, despite repeated efforts to annihilate it. It's very interesting that the story is never referred to again in the Hebrew Bible. It does become really interesting in rabbinic literature, especially to the Tanaim and the Amoraim, the rabbinic sages who redact the Mishnah, the Talmud, and all the principal works of rabbinic midrash. It seems fairly clear to most scholars that part of the reason that it becomes interesting is because it represents an archetypal rupture of the sort that the rabbis are trying to recover from, number one, and number two, that there are efforts by Christianity and later Islam to sort of claim the story for their own. And because Christianity, early Christianity views it as a prefiguration of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the rabbis are keen to interpret it to show the living aspects of covenant and the fact that Abraham's passage of the test and the assurance of covenant inheres and coheres to Judaism and not anyone else. There are silenced figures within those assumptions. Among the silenced figures are Ishmael and Hagar. And the question is, are the elements of the story prior to when we get to the Akedah, later interpolations meant to disprivilege competing societies? To what extent can we tease apart the different layers of the stories to understand to what extent it reflects history and to what extent it reflects polemic or apology? And from the feminist perspective, so in terms of the relationship with other surrounding and potentially antagonistic cultures, we have to think about the relationship of Abraham to Hagar and Ishmael, and of Isaac to Ishmael. Midrash spends a lot of time on this. But we also have to think about Sarah. And from the feminist perspective, Sarah is silenced and pushed away from this story. And Rabbinic Midrash spends a good deal of time with clear guilt feelings about the fact that this is so. And in fact, the rabbis infer, because the next Torah portion begins with the death of Sarah, that the news of what has occurred kills her. And it is through her death that the sorrowful suffering and lack of agency of the feminine is brought to light implicitly, not explicitly, in this story. In other words, this is another example of how gaps and fissures in the story of the Akedah say as much as, if not more than, the story does itself. And this is why it's so redolent with meaning and so ripe for interpretation. Because what does not happen, what is not told, forces us to interpret. And that may in fact be one of the principal purposes of the story. That, as James Kugel says, early on, God is everywhere. And as Torah goes on, God becomes more and more of a distant figure, and more interpretation is expected and demanded. Ritual is set, law is promulgated. All of this is meant, in a way, one could say, to try to get the Israelite religious ontology and epistemology wrapped around the idea that now you have the laws, the strictures, the positive and negative commandments. Now you must interpret them and do it on your own. This is the fulfillment of covenant. And that can't take place without the radical series of interpretations that Abraham has to make to begin with. He sets biblical interpretation on its path by doing what he does. And of course, the interpreters, the redactors, the scribes of that story, who stitch together different versions, take up that task, possibly from Abraham himself and Isaac himself, and they commemorate Ishmael and Sarah, the silenced voices who now speak to us from the fissures of that text.